Okay, folks, so transitioning from Sennett to David Harvey, we're going to look at a chapter from David Harvey's text, 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism. Let's say, firstly, a few things about Harvey in general. David Harvey is a living critical geographer. He's trained in geography, and he is a prominent contemporary Marxist. Many of his books are focused on urban development, and that's the area for which he's best known. His breakthrough work was The Limits to Capital, which was originally published in 1972, which looked at the essential contradictions that are inherent to capitalism from a Marxist perspective. Much more recently, he was a very outspoken supporter of Occupy Wall Street and has defended the idea of a right to the city. You can see videos of Harvey staking out his position on Democracy Now! If you look at their online archive. In the chapter that I gave you to read, Harvey is interested in pointing out what are called the contradictions of capitalism through a Marxist lens. He writes the following vis-a-vis the relationship between competition and monopoly. The history of capitalism demonstrates a penchant, a tendency for monopoly rather than competition. And this would not be so favorable for innovation. Instead, we find a strong collective generic preference, a culture, as it were, emerging among capitalists for increasing efficiency and productivity across all capitalist enterprises, with or without the driving force of competition. So it's very often noted, particularly by those who have a Marxist tendency, that capitalism never really lives up to its own ideal, in the sense of the ideal perhaps of capitalism might be that there are many competitors and that this keeps the market lean and that it provides the broadest choice to the consumer. What we actually find under capitalism is a tendency towards monopoly or duopoly. So think of the great internet giants, or the way that the entertainment sector is monopolized by a few corporations, the energy giants, and so on and so forth. It seems, in fact, that in every sector, the small producers and suppliers are supplanted. Amazon would be an obvious example of a company that enjoys near monopoly status. But this is then begs the question of, well, what happens to competition, and is competition really a necessary element? In this particular quotation, Harvey talks about the drive towards efficiency and productivity, but this is not necessarily through the vehicle of competition. He further writes, the diffusion of new technologies occurs through a mix of consent and coercion. The development of military technologies, on the other hand, has become nothing short of a scandalous racket, whereby a vast military industrial complex feeds endlessly at the trough of public finance while innovating for innovation's sake. Harvey here is referring to what became called, what was first called in the 1950s by Eisenhower, the military industrial complex. This was a description of the US military in the 1950s, but could be more generalized to the military of all of the great economic and political powers. What's striking about military is that, of course, it's state-funded. It's state-funded, but there's a lot of private interests that tend to sap money from that state funding. Most obviously in theaters of war, we have companies such as Blackwater, which became notorious a decade or so ago for essentially bringing in billions of state funding for their own operations. And this is striking in a capitalist framework where the mantra of neoliberal capitalism is for small government, but military spending has been ever expanding in the United States and has massively sapped public finances over the decades. Harvey writes further, the recent history of deindustrialization and its association with dramatic technological configurations is an obvious case in point. Technological change is neither costless nor painless, and the costs and the pain are not evenly shared. The question always to be asked is, who gains from the creation and who bears the brunt of the destruction? Harvey here is leaning on this phrase, creative destruction, as a description for the way that capitalism works. And through the Marxist lens, Harvey is not given to the idea that technology is neutral. It's something that can be used well or something that can be used in not so well purposes. The point for Harvey is who is behind technological innovation and who does it serve? And just as we saw with the Graeber piece, when Graeber said, well, the values of society are dictated by the 1% who own everything, so too Harvey, broadly speaking, would have that kind of analysis vis-a-vis technology. Technology doesn't simply arise out of public demand. Technology is driven by the profit motive, and the profits go to the small minority who are at the top of the heap. Therefore, our technology is pushed in certain directions because it yields profits for the super wealthy. We can expand on this under the rubric of technology and power. And Harvey writes the following: controls over the means of communication has become a vital aspect to the reproduction of capitalist class power, and the new media technologies, the social media in particular, have potentialities as well as pitfalls for the dynamics of class struggle, as has become all too apparent in recent uprisings in Cairo, Istanbul, and other cities around the world. Harvey is writing this in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the uprising in 2011 and 2012, the Arab Spring, and then following it, Occupy Wall Street. These uprisings, these urban uprisings across the world. Now, on the one hand, particularly in the Arab Spring, social media, Facebook, and so forth, were touted as having played a very important role in terms of democratic free speech and the ability to get out messages that would be otherwise suppressed. But at the same time, Harvey, again, as a Marxist, is only too aware that who owns the means of communication. And this isn't a detail. You can't simply say, well, let's not worry about who owns all of these mega social media companies. Let's just focus on the fact that everyone can avail of them, and that therefore they're simply in and of themselves democratizing. You always, according to Harvey, have to ask the question, who owns the company, and follow the money back to the source. He writes further, the trend to create fictitious capitals that circulate freely has accelerated remarkably alongside all manner of predatory practices within the credit system that have contributed to a wave of accumulation by dispossession and speculation in asset values. One of Harvey's focuses is the financial industries. This came out very strongly in the 2008 crisis when Obama at the time, the outgoing Bush Jr., and Obama coming in 2008-9, was faced with either bailing out banks or trying to help homeowners who were in trouble because they couldn't afford to keep on paying down their mortgages when their real estate assets were worth less than in real terms than what they were worth on paper. And in that situation, it was very clear that the banks got bailed out, the banks got the bulk of the money, and sure, there was some infrastructure funding and so forth, but the distressed homeowners were not relieved of their debt. I've touched on this before when we talked about when we were talking about Graeber and the disinclination to relieve people of debt. What Harvey's talking about here in terms of fictitious capital a lot of this has to do with real estate speculation. Real estate has been one of the primary ways in which the most developed economies, the United States, the UK, and so forth, have really kept their economy afloat, whilst at the same time winding down a lot of manufacturing and the wealth that comes from that. And the other side of this is sort of speculative economy, that's to say, the stock market, which includes things like agricultural futures and so forth, where it's really all about betting, essentially. It's almost like a form of gambling about what the prices of commodities will be in the future. And a lot of money can be made very quickly in this sort of a way. And then obviously the stock market itself and valuations in companies. All of this is the sort of, is really where the action is at in the 21st century economy, rather than manufacturing and so forth. And he goes on, there have certainly been examples of intense resistance to new technological configurations on moral and ethical grounds, everything from the struggle of the Luddites against the introduction of machines to the revolt of the physicists against the possibility of nuclear weapons. Current controversies rage over the ethics and inadvisability of genetic engineering and genetically modified foods. So Harvey's simply pointing out the social history, that technology to some extent has always met with opposition to do with concerns about morals and so forth, about losing jobs in the case of the Luddites, machine breaking and so forth, or the deployment of nuclear technology for destructive purposes. And he points out that one of the cutting edge topics on this presently relates to GMOs and GM foods. This has certainly been controversial. The United States is a great proponent of genetically modified foods, whereas over and against that, the European Union has been extremely cautious and has effectively banned most GM foods. And this has created something of a tension, a global political tension over the access of GM foods into the European market. And that's just sort of one area. There's also health concerns about GM foods and so forth. And also just the basic, if you like, consumer rights to be informed about the source of food. So Harvey here is making kind of a general point about social resistance to technological innovation. So how does this play out in the work world, which is our primary focus in this first half of the class? Well, on this, Harvey writes the following: control over the labor process and the laborer has always been central to capital's ability to sustain profitability and capital accumulation. Throughout its history, capital has invented, innovated, and adopted technological forms whose dominant aim has been to enhance capital's control over labor in both the labor process and the labor market. Now, Harvey is really, as it were, well and truly getting off the fence. Why do we have technological innovation? What does innovation really mean through technology? And Harvey is saying, first and foremost, control of labor power. To that extent, a technology that will hand more control over to the employer vis-a-vis the employees will always be favored. As a Marxist, Harvey insists that technology is never neutral in that sense. Technology is always a medium, in a sense, for waging war on labor. As a Marxist, Harvey sees history as a process of class conflict, and therefore technology is a way of controlling the working class, essentially. He writes further, Marx argued that technological innovation was a crucial weapon in class struggle, and that many an innovation has been adopted by capital with the sole aim of breaking strikes. There certainly arose within this the fetish belief on the part of capital that the solution to ever-increasing profitability was endless technological innovation directed towards the disciplining and disempowering of the worker. Harvey is raising a further question and problem here, that when he talks about fetish power, that perhaps business is too enamored in technology, such that it, in some cases, the technological, seeming technological fixes that capital will be motivated to bring in won't actually enhance productivity, but they'll just do it because they feel that somehow it gives them the edge over labor power. And that could potentially be at odds even with the profit motive in certain instances. Expanding on the same point, Harvey writes, the role of technologically induced unemployment is in regulating the wage rate, the pursuit of ever cheaper goods for the sustenance of the labor force, the Walmart phenomenon, to make lower wages more acceptable. The assault upon any hint of a basic social wage as encouraging idleness on the part of labor and the like form a domain of class struggle where technological innovations, interventions and mediations become crucial. So here Harvey is basically sort of listing some of the ways in which technology is deployed to discipline labor. One would be relentless, in certain sectors, particularly electronic goods and so forth, lowering of prices. Now, this will always be portrayed and spun as, doing things to help the consumer, but this is also done, as Harvey points out, to placate people and to make them accept lower wages over time. In countries like the United States, real wages have not increased for 2 generations now. And there have been various ways in which capitalism has got away with that. One is to just keep on rationalizing the production process so that you can provide goods to consumers at lower and lower prices. And the other, as we touched on before, is the explosion in credit, so that you can make credit much more freely available, and that can, as it were, take up the slack from real term decreases in wages over time. The book is entitled 17 Contradictions, and here's the contradiction as Harvey articulates it vis-a-vis technological innovation. He writes, so here is the central contradiction. If social labor is the ultimate source of value and profit, then replacing it with machines or robotic labor makes no sense, either politically or economically. But we can see all too clearly what the mechanism is that heightens the contradiction to the point of crisis. Individual entrepreneurs or corporations see labor-saving innovation as critical to their profitability vis-a-vis competitors. This collectively undermines the possibility of profit. So there's different ways to try to get at this thought that Harvey is pointing out in terms of what he sees as the central contradiction of technological innovation. I think the easiest way to get at this is to point to, in a sense, the sort of supply-demand equilibrium. Now, if you rationalize the process whereby of production, whereby you need less and less workers, the problem then becomes who is going to consume the goods that you're producing. If more and more people are left wageless, and there isn't a very robust social security, social safety net, then where is the demand going to come from? Again, you can try to use as a band-aid to that credit, but eventually there'll be a crisis in the sense that there simply won't be the consumer power out there to consume the goods that are being produced. So at some point down the line, you have to come up with a different kind of solution. Now, again, we've seen with Graeber that perhaps one solution, strangely enough, has been to create jobs which are not necessary, thereby at least giving people the wages that they need to go out and consume. Another, which Sennett talks about in a different context and we consider in a different video lecture, is something like a universal basic income, whereby essentially through taxation, taxing corporations and so forth, you simply redistribute a certain amount of money to consumers, so that's how they get the spending power. The difficulty in all of that, of course, is that it will still beg the question, what are people going to do with their time? And in some ways, it would be much easier if you just employ people, pay them a decent wage, and have them have the consumer power that they need to keep consumer capitalism going. That's the way it's operated throughout the 20th century through the sort of consumer boom. But what Harvey is getting at here is that capitalism inherently tends to create these crises, which get to a certain point where it seems like the whole machine is going to break down. And in this case, labor-saving technological innovation seems to render the firm more profitable, but eventually we'll get to a point where, as I say, nobody can actually afford the services or the products of the company, and thereby rendering it unprofitable. So there's a problem here of the circulation of value that capitalism inherently, in and of itself, seems incapable of solving. So more in the same vein, Harvey writes, but what sort of disaster are we looking at? Larger and larger segments of the world's population will be considered redundant and disposable as productive workers from the standpoint of capital, and will have a hard time surviving both materially and psychologically. Alienated from any prospect of a meaningful existence in the realm of necessary labor as defined by capital, they will have to look elsewhere to construct a meaningful life. On the other hand, output will be increasing, but where will the corresponding increase in demand come from? So that last point is the point that I was dwelling on in the previous quote. But also Harvey points to the social and psychological damage that we know unemployment does. So again, and this intersects with Sennett's major concern, which is a sense of purposefulness and identity. If work is not going to be the way that people gain money, if you're going to have to engineer a UBI, a universal basic income scheme, then that will solve the money problem, but it won't solve the psychological and social and emotional problem of people feeling meaningful and useful within society. Because again, the thing about work is it's typically something that people do in a social public setting. And so it connects people to other people. And I suppose we could live in a future world where everyone's a sort of stay-at-home Etsy maker. But although that might be a way to make a precarious living, it won't produce the kind of social, psychological, emotional satisfactions that traditional work has done, whereby there are social connections, there's a place of work, and so on and so forth. So all of these in and of themselves will produce a kind of social crisis. If the technological innovation makes so many people jobless. And so this is another sort of dimension of the overall problem that Harvey is pointing to. And then ultimately, the big question for a Marxist like Harvey is, so what is the future of capitalism? Is it going to keep on going? Is there going to be a final crisis? And this is his reflection on this. He writes, the money form has acquired a good deal of autonomy over the last 40 years. This text was written about 10 years ago. So he's looking really back through to the 80s and 90s. Fiat and fictitious values created by the world's central banks have taken over. This leads us back to some reflections on the relation between the path of technological evolution we have described and the evolution of monetary technologies. The rise of cyber monies like Bitcoin, in some instances seemingly constructed for purposes of money laundering around illegal activities, is just the beginning of an inexorable descent of the monetary system into chaos. Harvey often talks about the gold standard that used to be the thing against which the global currency was measured, and the abandonment of that standard back in the 20th century. And now, of course, we retain a sort of global hegemonic currency, namely the US dollar. But Harvey's concern is that monetary value is being increasingly virtualized, such that there is really nothing tethering monetary value at all. And he's also referring, when he talks about fiat and central banks, again, this was the solution to the 2008 crisis, was essentially to print money. Central banks have the ability to print potentially limitless money and simply put that money into circulation. Now to ordinary people like you and I, that just seems like magic. I mean, they literally have a money machine whereby they just pump out billions and billions of dollars and put those into circulation. And in effect, that's what a sovereign government can do. However, Harvey's concern as a Marxist is this has no relationship to the so-called real economy, the productive economy, most obviously manufacturing. And if you derealize money to this extent, then you risk plunging, firstly, the financial sector and then the economy in general, as he says, into a kind of chaos. So we sort of round off this section here with the following quote. Harvey writes, "Any struggle to combat worldwide environmental degradation, social inequalities and impoverishment, perverse population dynamics, deficits in global health, education and nutrition, and military and geopolitical tensions will entail the mobilization of many of our currently available technologies to achieve non-capitalistic social, ecological, and political ends." As a good Marxist, Harvey recognizes that capitalism is necessary to true freedom, but not sufficient. So he's not a technophobe in the sense that he doesn't want all these technologies to go away, but it's really about the ownership of the technological means of production. That's the thing that needs to shift. So it's not that virtual technologies, computer technologies, it's not that we need to uninvent all of these things, but it's really the ownership model that needs to change. And that is, of course, the key idea behind socialism, communism, that we have to, in traditional classic terms, we have to abolish private property and make it collective property. And of course, that would be a revolutionary change, and that is the Marxist vision. But just to be clear on this point, it's not that all the capitalist innovations should be done away with, and as it were, we go back to a pre-industrial situation. It's rather the conversion of the ownership model that's necessary to solve what Harvey considers the contradiction. So that rounds off our first foray into David Harvey's work. And we've considered here, both in the work of Sennett and in the work of Harvey, the impact on work and on labor of technological innovation, and more specifically, the rollout of automation and automated obsolescence of certain types of jobs. This is just one dimension of the politics of work, and I hope it's made the case that work is very relevant to our contemporary discussions of social and political thinking. In future lectures, I'll consider some further issues around this. But for now, I'll round this off, and then we'll turn our attention to some future issues.